The Hypogeum of Ħal Saflieni oozes mystery and has so many rumours about it that it's hard to separate fact from fiction. It was first found in 1902 during building work in one of the houses that stood on top of it. The priest archaeologist Manuel Magri led the initial excavations, but then died in Tunisia while visiting the Maltese community there for Easter celebrations before his notes could be published. The notes were never found. The famous archaeologist Sir Temi Zammit continued the excavations with a team, and they wrote several reports about their findings. The Hypogeum is located in the village of Paula, near the Grand Harbour, and is now surrounded by buildings. Although, of course, in the Neolithic period, the landscape would have been very different. Several houses which sat over the top of it were removed to make way for a museum. At the time of filming this, access is limited to 10 people per guided tour to protect the environment inside, and tickets mostly need to be booked in advance. The Hypogeum is 600 metres west of the Tarshian temples, 1 kilometre south of the Cordon 3 temple site, around 1.5 kilometres south of the destroyed sites of Cordon 1 and Cordon 2, and 1 kilometre north of the Santa Lucia Hypogeum. So that means it's one of 6 temple period sites, all within walking distance of one another. The Santa Lucia Hypogeum has only been partially excavated and is a lot smaller than Ħal Saflieni. In the annual museum report covering the period from April 1973 to March 1974, the discovery of Santa Lucia during the building of a housing estate was discussed. At that time, it had a megalithic entrance above ground, which is no longer there. As you can see from the photograph, there's nothing really visible above ground apart from a few stones. The area is protected and gated off, but it's possible to see a few things through the railings. The only other underground complex from the temple period is the Shara stone circle close to the Gigantea temples on Gozo. It's possible there are many more which have not yet been found. There are quite a few simple lobed rock-cut tombs from the temple period, but they can't really be described as complexes. Ħal Saflieni is built on 3 levels underground, but there's evidence that there used to be a megalithic above-ground entrance, just as with Santa Lucia, which has been lost. The first or upper level is made up of natural caves, which were enlarged to house burials. These may have been in use from as early as the Zebush phase, so around 4000 BCE, which would make them contemporary with other simple lobed rock-cut tombs around the islands. The middle level was carved out during the temple period from around 3300 BCE and gives its name to the Saflieni phase of prehistory. It has a whole bunch of finely carved trilithon and portal-style entrances, some of which connect one area to another and some of which don't go anywhere at all, doorways to nowhere. This is also the location of the room referred to as the Holy of Holies. This hall looks as though it was carved to imitate the overground temples with its trilithon and portholes in relief. The corbelled ceiling is thought to show how the now roofless temples originally looked. During the winter solstice, natural light filters down through the upper level and shines on the imitation temple facade. So it may have been created that way on purpose for astronomical reasons. The chamber behind the facade was only partially carved out, so it's as though it was abandoned quite suddenly. The Hypogeum stopped being used around 2500 BCE during the Tarshian phase. Another room on this middle level is referred to as the oracle room and has acoustic properties with a double resonance of 70 Hz and 114 Hz. Both frequencies have been found to have an effect on brain activity, which could mean the Hypogeum was used for chanting or some other ritual process needing sound. A niche in the wall in this room is referred to as the oracle hole and may have served a similar purpose to the one with the same name in Hajar'im. Whatever that purpose was is not known for sure, but one idea is that it was for priestly communications, and the acoustic properties of the Hypogeum do kind of bolster this idea. In some photographs, and from visiting the Hypogeum myself, it's clear to me that there are libation holes in the ground in the Holy of Holies, just as in the above ground temples. The wands in the temples are generally thought to be for pouring liquid offerings into them during a ritual. I found an article by Griffiths, who was one of the students that helped Zamet excavate the Hypogeum. In the National Geographic in 1920, he says the two holes were found plugged with stones and the one on the right had a ram's horns in it. This makes me wonder if all libation holes were originally for ritual deposits such as this and were actually covered, which would make them far more practical. The fact that they are usually carved into threshold stones means that you would have to step over them to enter the temple or section of a temple, which makes them a little inconvenient. A theory in Temple Places by the Fraxis Project says that these libation holes could have been for wooden stakes with animal skulls on them, rather than for liquid offerings. A theory which supports the wealth of evidence that ritual feasting took place at the sites. However, now that I've read this about the libation holes at the Hypogeum, I wonder if the same use could be applied to all the temples, only the subterranean sanctuary remained in better condition with its plugs in place. There's also, on this level, a round 2-meter deep pit in the centre, which is rather strange and seems a bit dangerous. It's funnel shaped and has a hole in the wall above it which joins to the main hall. Perhaps it was for storage or something more creepy. Griffiths surmises in the same National Geographic article that it was a pit for sacred serpents used for rituals. But there's no other snake symbolism in the Hypogeum as far as I know. In fact, the only snake carving really in Malta from the temple period is the one at Gigantea. Similar to Tarshian, Hazraim, Amnidra and Gigantea, I've noticed tunnel-shaped holes at the side of portal entrances within the Hypogeum. In the temples, these are thought to be a sort of Neolithic hinge for creating a barrier across the entrance, something that was made of a material long since decomposed. So it would seem the Hypogeum has similar barriers separating different areas. The lower level is 10 metres below ground. No bones or other finds were excavated from it. So a popular theory is that it was used for storage. I find it quite weird because the steps down to it don't seem to go all the way to the bottom. In my mind, there was water or something there, maybe an underground river, and the steps were a sort of jetty. This is all wild fantasy, of course, but it just seems really impractical otherwise. Quite a few areas of the Hypogeum are inconveniently laid out like this. In early reports, the archaeologists theorised that wooden steps may have been there originally, which have not survived, but I don't know. Photography is not allowed in the Hypogeum, so what I'm showing here are mostly old pictures from the public domain, and they are therefore not of the highest quality. It's difficult to pick out the details that I'm talking about. There are brilliant modern photographs by Daniel Cillier in many of the illustrated guides and books on the archaeology and history of Malta. I've referenced them in the description below. Many of these can be bought online from Heritage Malta or the usual book sites if you want to see more details of the Hypogeum. Even when I've been to the Hypogeum with the low lighting and limited access, it's hard to see all the things described in the literature. I do notice things I haven't seen before when I go through books. Also on the Heritage Malta website, you can take a virtual tour of the Hypogeum for free, which is fantastic. Some of the walls have red ochre on them, so may have been totally painted in it originally. There are also red ochre spirals, discs, other patterns, and a black and white checkerboard decorating walls and ceilings. Some of the stone orthostats forming parts of trilithons have pitted decorations on them similar to the overground temples. There are intriguing references in early papers on the Hypogeum to a 6-fingered hand carving in a wall and a painting of a bull, both of which have disappeared. I read through Ridley's 1971 publication, The Megalithic Art of the Maltese Islands, where he describes the hand and the bull. According to him, the bull painting was 100 by 154 centimetres and looked as though it had been made by accident or on purpose when a section of red ochre spirals was being wiped off. So it could be a lot later than the temple period and might not be reflective of bull symbolism at all. He also mentioned that the hand carving was really difficult to make out and might just be natural with its shape coincidental. Flint and chert scrapers and knives were excavated from the Hypogeum, along with shell and stone pendants, buttons and figurines. Many pendants were axe-shaped. Some of the more enigmatic finds include a black plate with long-horned bulls and goats etched onto it, the famous sleeping lady figurine, and a finely carved bed or couch with a person lying face down on it. The sleeping lady shows a corpulent person similar to the fat lady statues that are found throughout Malta, lying on her side with her eyes closed. The figure is wearing a pleated skirt, no top, and has a bob haircut or wig with a recessive hairline. Just as with the fat lady statues, the sex isn't clear. A popular theory for what this person is supposed to be doing is that it shows a goddess in a trance-like state, receiving visions to share with people in an oracular setting, kind of like the Oracle of Delphi or something like that. In the Archaeology of Malta and Gozo, Anthony Bonanno mentions that this may show a person undergoing incubation. For those of you who don't know, in classical antiquity, incubation was the act of sleeping in a sacred place to receive divine inspiration from dreams, and it's entirely possible that this practice was rooted in the distant past, all the way back to the Stone Age, or earlier. So that's what we could be seeing represented by the sleeping lady, and also the person laying face down on a bed. Conical shaped stones of varying sizes were also found in the Hypogeum, with the tallest ones being 25 centimetres in height. These were the same shape as two which were found plugging holes to small pits that were connected to one another under the ground. So it's possible they were all used for that, but what were the pits for? Who knows? There were also various round stone spheres found, which are referred to in early texts as sling stones. Stone spheres are found at various temple sites, including Tarshian, Gigantea, Hajar'im, and Tassilj, and are often called rollers because it's thought they may have been used to shift the megaliths into place. Since the Hypogeum is mostly carved out to look like the above-ground temples, without actually having transported huge megaliths into it, this explanation wouldn't really make sense. But also, how useful would sling stones be down there? Evidence points to the temple people having been peace-loving and not encountering battles with one another or outsiders, so it's unlikely sling stones were used as weapons. Perhaps they were used for hunting, but then it would surely make more sense to leave these heavy objects above ground rather than dragging them into the underground maze. Literature often refers to the thousands of bones discovered in the Hypogeum and their dolichocephalic or long-headed skulls. In actual fact, thousands of bones were not found. In the excavation notes, it was reported that a lot of bones were found in one small area, but were in terrible condition due to the damp and soil deposits surrounding them, so mostly disintegrated on touch. It was estimated from this that a large volume of bones, numbering thousands, could have once existed throughout the Hypogeum, but these hadn't survived the difficult conditions. All of the bones that were found were disarticulated, as if they had just been thrown in. So they were thought not to have belonged to primary burials. Only 11 skulls were excavated intact. These are currently on display at the Museum of Archaeology in Valletta. Based on the measurements in use at the time, Zammit reported that they were dolichocephalic, which, since their discovery, has led people to think they might be of an alien species or could be due to head binding, something that was practiced in ancient Peru and a few other places. However, according to modern-day parameters for the analysis of skulls, they are all sized normally, except for one that belonged to a person suffering from a condition called craniosynostosis. If you look at the photographs in a report by Zammit, to the untrained eye, they don't really look long-headed at all. It's important to remember that the analysis the experts made were based on much more complex criteria than simply looking at them. And the science behind this has become far more refined since then, so the general consensus has changed. In the subterranean sanctuary at Ħal Saflieni by Anthony Mifsud and Simon Mifsud, The red soil that was found throughout all levels of the Hypogeum when it was first excavated is discussed. Rather than a gradual build-up of soil over time, starting with the lower levels, it looks as though the deposit flooded in from surrounding fields all in one go, and may have carried the bones with it. This would explain their disarticulated nature, and it would mean the Hypogeum had a similar ritual purpose to the temples, rather than being a necropolis. It's worth mentioning the Santa Lucia Hypogeum in this context as well. Disarticulated bones, pottery and amulets were found mixed with soil just as at Ħal Saflieni, to quote the museum report from that year. As in the Hypogeum, from which the new site is only half a mile distant, there are no regular inhumations, but a filling made up of stony soil containing the above-mentioned finds, as if the mass had been dumped inside the monument from the surface. That said, the general theory about the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum is that it had a dual purpose over the course of its history, a burial site and a ritual centre. There are some pretty epic rumours about the Hypogeum. In 1940, the National Geographic published an article where the author talked about their travels in Malta. They said that locals had told them about school children and their teacher having gone missing in the Hypogeum a couple of decades after its discovery when on a tour of it. According to the story, connecting tunnels are all over the islands, and you used to be able to get from one end of Malta to the other by walking underground. However, after the school children went missing, never to be found again, the tunnels were sealed for safety. This story appears to be an urban myth, since many people have looked for newspaper reports from the time and cannot find a reference to this having happened. And you would also expect relatives of the people who went missing to pass the details down in their families. Of course, there are many tunnels in the Maltese Islands, that's true. There are dozens of Paleo-Christian catacombs, which probably started out as natural caves before being expanded, just as with the Hypogeum. There are also many caves with Pleistocene fossils, tunnels from drainage systems dating to the early modern period, and World War II bunker systems. The islands are made up of soft limestone, which erodes easily, and is also not difficult to carve manually. However, it's a bit of a stretch to say that all the tunnel systems and natural caves are linked. Also, the Hypogeum is fully excavated, so shouldn't have any extra tunnels leading off from it, making the story even more unlikely. Another story was from a British woman called Lois Jessup, who visited the Hypogeum in the 1940s and asked the guide if she could explore further on her own. She found an extension to the lower level, which took her out onto a ledge overlooking a vast cavern, and apparently saw giant humanoids walking along a ledge on the opposite side of it. Turning back out of fear, she felt something brush past her, and it made her candle go out. She then visited the Hypogeum again and found the tunnel to be boarded up, and found that the guide she had met before no longer worked there. No other stories of giant humanoids have ever been reported, and no one else was with Lois at the time that she saw them, so it's hard to verify what she said. And like I say, the Hypogeum is fully excavated and well documented. I also think if that had really happened, why would you go back there? But when you go to the Hypogeum, it really does have a mysterious atmosphere, just as with the temples, except it's got the added element of being underground with very low lighting. I think there's a lot we don't understand about what was happening during that time in Malta. I think the temple people had sophisticated rituals, and that the islands were an important centre for this sort of activity. It's quite possible that the ancients understood astronomy, geometry and mathematics more than we realise. Visits to the Hypogeum mostly need to be booked in advance from the Heritage Malta website, but sometimes last-minute tickets can be purchased from the site itself if there is availability. I've put a link in the description below. For further reading, I've listed the papers and books I used to research this video below as well. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to my channel. GPS locations of sites I've visited are listed on my website, and do follow me on Instagram for more content.